Welcome to Freedom of Thought, a podcast by Humanist International, with me, Leon Langdon.
And me, Gary McClelland.
Each week, we'll be discussing news, research, policy developments, and campaigns related to freedom of thought around the world. Later in today's episode, you'll hear from Christian Lomsdalen, who is the president of the Norwegian Humanist Association. But Gary, before that, I feel like we need to wish each other or our listeners a belated, at this point, happy World Humanist Day.
Yes, happy World Humanist Day, Leon. We're recording this the day after World Humanist Day on the 22nd of June. By the time this goes out, it will have been like a week ago, but the good wishes persevere nonetheless.
You might know this. Why actually is it on June 21st? It's like summer solstice.
Yes, that's part of it. So World Humanist Day started being celebrated, if you like, by the American Humanist Association and some of its chapters in the 1980s, and it wasn't really an official thing, but it was felt that, you know, there's World Day of different things, and it was felt that a day to kind of commemorate and, I guess, mark the importance of humanism was a good thing to do. And it wasn't until the 1990s, actually, that American Humanist Association and us, Humanist International, passed a series of resolutions to sort of agree that, yes, we will mark the 21st of June, summer solstice, in the Northern Hemisphere as World Humanist Day. So ever since then, it's been a point in the calendar to kind of recognise humanism.
I think Harry did a great social media post, even just looking back on the achievements over the last year, everything from new ceremonies being launched in different parts of the world, and then closer to where you and I are, even blasphemy laws being repealed in Northern Ireland. I think it's been a pretty good year overall. I mean, the world is tough, as we've, I know season one, I feel like we talked constantly about religious nationalism and everything else, and this season too, to be fair. It's a tough world, but I do feel like not only are we, but I think really the heart of the movement, the humanist organisations, our members around the world are really fighting the good fight, as it were.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it is important, whilst we are going through these unprecedented global challenges, to also find some of the hope and the positive news to celebrate.
Yeah, I think listeners have a conversation with Christian to look forward to, and I know the Norwegians do so much kind of across a real sort of taking humanism as a life stance. You know, there can be debate within the movement even as to what humanism means and what it is, but I think looking for real embodied, lived humanism, you know, from birth to death, as it were, this sort of one life that the humanists believe we have, I think is really embodied by a lot of the work that they do up there.
There's an interesting, actually, article that one of our former members of staff published. He proposed a 3-stage model of development for a humanist organisation, starting off in a country where humanists are persecuted. And so we would think maybe of a country like Afghanistan, not legal to set up a humanist organisation. You would be very heavily persecuted for doing so. So the initial starting point would be gathering together as a group and starting those alliances. Then you would move into stage 2, which would be, okay, you can exist and you have the right to, you know, exist as humanists and so on, but because of a dominant influence of religion, because of the lack of secularism and separation of church and state and rule of law and so on, the biggest preoccupation of your organisation will be campaigning for secularism, for the removal of church privileges or religious privileges, so that you can exist in a sort of semi-equal civic space. And then the third stage would be, once you had made some progress towards achieving that secular balance, that open, free society, then it comes down to the real nitty-gritty of humanism. Like, how do we actually live as humanists? How do you embrace the naturalistic life, the one life that we have? How do you actually live that out and embody it in practice? So anyway, that just came to my mind. We should probably dig that article out and publish it, because I think it's quite an interesting lens through which to see some of the different challenges.
I think it's also then particularly interesting for us as an international organisation to be across those three contexts. You know, we have research, which, you know, the Freedom of Thought report, which obviously looks at every country and sort of has to, I guess, condense all of those dimensions. We do advocacy across those three. I think, you know, we obviously do a lot of work on, for example, like you said, Afghanistan or countries where you know, there's blasphemy laws, where you cannot be openly non-religious, but then also in that sort of middle category where there are, you know, maybe more, there's more that can be achieved, for lack of a better word. And that's, I feel, really where we can kind of elevate our members' voices internationally. And then, of course, working with the Norwegians and many others who are very lucky and have done a lot of work to get to that sort of third category. I really like that. I think speaking of being an international organization, for our listeners, hopefully by the time this goes out, we will no longer be experiencing a heat wave across the UK and Western Europe. But I'm personally wishing we had an air-conditioned office right now, but also there's kind of a lot of conversations that we're having about that sort of being international, being representative and represented around the world. Obviously, we have members of staff around the world, but I think we're also trying, Gary, to have more sort of in-person, or to simulate some sort of in-person stuff.
That's right, yes. It's a constant challenge. I mean, there's downsides to being a team solely based in London, with having less international perspectives on the staff team, and then there's downsides to having everybody work remotely, and we're trying to see what we can do to be creative about that. So for example, today we had an online session which was a sort of joint session with the board and the staff to review the Freedom of Thought report, some of the challenges and opportunities and some of the monitoring and evaluation that we're doing on the work behind the Freedom of Thought report. So it's just one of the ways. I mean, I gave the example to the board that when I worked in previous NGOs, quite a common thing to do was to have a sort of open day where all the staff would be in the office and you would invite board members in, and it wasn't a formal meeting, but they would just go around the office and chat to people and say, "Hi Leon, what are you working on and how are things going?" And they would just pick up a sense of things, like there's a busy project happening, I can see that people are very preoccupied, or understand what's underlying all the work we do. So we're trying to do things that we can to create that sense of togetherness and openness that is difficult to do otherwise. Because when we think about board meetings, we have 3 or 4 in-person board meetings per year, but it's really a small touch point throughout the whole year that we get to actually sit down and work together. So we're trying to find more ways to be creative about that.
And we're all going to be together this time next week in London as well, Gary. I think we're going canoeing.
That's right. We're having our quarterly staff meeting, so we'll be together for 2 or 3 days, and we'll be going through a lot of planning for the Congress, evaluating previous work. We'll continue to do some of our internal work on AI and how we're using different AI tools and different tech tools and things like that, and have some dinners. A very important part of this, like you've mentioned, is being remote and not having much of a chance to spend time together. I think it's just really important that we actually spend some time, have a nice meal together, get to know each other. And then, yes, as a bit of a team building activity, we're going to be doing canoeing. So I've not done that for a very long time. I think it'll be interesting. Hopefully it won't be too warm when we're out and about in London.
Again, hopefully, if the heat wave is still going by then, I'm going to be worried.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to get in the water, but that doesn't sound like a terribly wise idea either.
And that grim thought, I think now would be a lovely time to introduce our guest, Christian.
Christian Lomsdalen is a Norwegian academic, scholar of religion, and the current president of the Norwegian Humanist Association, a position he has held since his election in 2021. He is widely recognised in Norway as a prominent secular humanist leader, academic researcher, as well as being an educational podcaster. So, Christian, welcome to this Freedom of Thought podcast.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for having me on this podcast. I have been looking forward to this.
Thank you so much for joining us, Christian. I really do feel like that last point from Gary, despite all of the other incredible things you do, I feel like that might be a great point to start. You're a podcaster yourself. You've told us you're a listener to this podcast, but you host a podcast yourself and have done so for much longer than this podcast existed. I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about that and tell our listeners about it.
Yes, thank you, Leon. I have been running an educational podcast for the last 9 years. It has had up to 200,000 yearly listeners, so it's a fairly big podcast in a Norwegian setting. Now it's more on a hobby basis again for the time being. It was very fun for many years, but one always grows tired of a hobby in the end. But I also have a humanist podcast, which I do sometimes with live feeds on Facebook as well. And I have a sexology podcast as well with the Norwegian Association for Clinical Sexologists.
Wow. Amazing range of interests. We were together last month, Christian, in Oslo, where Humanists International had a board meeting, very kindly hosted by the Norwegian Humanist Association. And during that weekend, the Norwegian Humanist Association invited us all as guests to one of the secular humanist confirmation ceremonies. And I think I mentioned to you at the time, but actually one of the first trips I did as chief executive of Humanists International was to Oslo to meet with the Norwegian Humanist Association, and went to a humanist confirmation ceremony. As someone coming from a culture where that's not typical, that the only real sort of confirmation ceremonies we have here that I'm aware of in the UK are through the Catholic Church, it was quite a remarkable thing to see. It's this group ceremony where the young people all experience it together with their families. It's obviously very artistic, and there's poetry, there's readings, there's music in Oslo Town Hall. I mean, it's a beautiful ceremony. And what we found out last month is that these ceremonies are now 75 years old, being practiced in Norway. So that must be now quite a major part of Norwegian culture to have these ceremonies.
Yes, and I'm very happy that we got to show you how our ceremonies are. We are immensely proud of the confirmation ceremonies, but they are also an important part of who we are as an organization and for why we started. So we started actually with confirmations 5 years before we were incorporated as an organization. So the confirmations have existed 5 years longer than the Norwegian Humanist Association. And all of this started because our founder, he wanted his daughter to have an alternative to the Christian confirmation. And in Norway, the confirmation ceremonies in the church has been obligatory by the state. So you had to have the confirmation ceremonies by law until 1912. So it's a very steadfast tradition in the Norwegian context. And this meant that even after it was no longer obligatory to have, almost everybody did this. So it has been a rite of passage for Norwegian youth for centuries. So it's quite ingrained in our tradition. And when this father, Christian Horn, established this tradition together with other parents and afterwards established the Norwegian Humanist Association, this has become an important tradition for us. So the name bears a resemblance to the Christian confirmation, and also that youth are being taught something. But of course, what they are being taught is not, well, necessarily the same. And for me as a humanist leader and for me as a humanist confirmation leader, I have been that for many years. What is the most important thing is not the ceremony. The ceremony is nice and pretty and of course important, but what is important is what we teach the youth as a part of the course that leads up to the ceremony. That's the most important thing for me. And being able to talk about humanism as a life stance, talking about critical thinking, democracy, human rights in a different way than one often do in school. That is really important, especially with all the polarization that is out there. And for us as an organization, we have contributed to the confirmation tradition during these 75 years. So both the Norwegian Church, us and researchers acknowledge that confirmation in Norway would probably not be as large a tradition today as it is without the Norwegian humanists, because the youth, they ended up choosing between one or the other, or they didn't choose that I want to be confirmed or not. They chose between two different kinds. Now there's actually more different kinds of confirmations. So Norway is the only country in the world with Buddhist confirmations, which is my favorite factoid about confirmations, because this is not something that one do in other countries in the same level. Of course, there are other countries with secular confirmations, but Buddhist confirmations, that is a very rare Norwegian thing. And that we have contributed to this, I find quite interesting.
I think the work of your organization, Christian, across so many different parts of Norwegian life is really something incredible. And I think it's something many of our other member organizations across the world really look at. And I know, as well as the confirmations, there's baby naming ceremonies, there's weddings, there's funerals, but also there's chaplaincy. And I think that really speaks to what you're talking about giving people the kind of skills to get through life.
Yes, and doing chaplaincy is something that is quite new for us. This is something that started back in 2021. So we haven't been doing this, or 2019. Well, it's fairly recent. However, we decided to get into doing chaplaincy and doing it in a more organized way. So, of course, we always had our celebrants being able to go out and meet people that were grieving or similar, but with our expansion into humanist existential care, we are now working to get our chaplains into the army, into universities, into hospitals, into prisons, into different kinds of institutions where people might need existential care and where they are not able to leave to meet us. It's often more difficult than if you are in living at home, living your normal, regular life. So that is important. And here we really need to learn from other countries that has been doing this far longer than we have. So, and this is a quite a large painting to paint, because we need to get into these institutions as well. So at the moment, there are about 50 priests that are chaplains in the military and 2 humanist chaplains. And there are, depending on how you count on where we are in the process, 2 hospital humanists as well. And of course, there are about 50 priests doing the same job. So this is a quite gradual work, and we need to explain that we are needed. But what we do see when we get out there, when we are in the institutions, when the people have the opportunity to choose a humanist service, they ask for a humanist service as often as they ask for a churchly service. Sometimes they don't care who they want to talk to. That is, of course, okay. I just want to talk to someone, and someone that is not going to treat me or be a psychologist or different kind of services. I just want to talk to an existential care worker, and that is, of course, okay. But of those that I want this kind of existential worker or that kind of existential worker, we see that people ask for a humanist existential care worker as much as they ask for a Christian existential care worker. So that we find quite satisfying and a good fact to bring out to the hospitals, to the military, and different. So we need to learn from the UK, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from other countries where they have been doing this for a long time. And it's necessary for us to, because it's expected of us from our members, that this is something that a life stance organization provides, that this is something that we need to provide to our members and to the greater public, because people sometimes have difficulties in their lives, and you might need to talk to someone that does not want to treat you, just want to listen to you and help you organize your thoughts.
I think it's an amazing program, and from my point of view, it goes to the heart of our values as humanists. We talk about living the one life we have and freedom, and I think the reality and the fragility and preciousness that can bring to life. But I think, we have to be honest that it's also a way of life that, or a life stance which can bring about existential concerns, as you might expect. Obviously, we don't have an expectation of an afterlife or some better version of a life yet to come. For us, this is the one life that we have, and as we all know from our experiences being human beings, it can be very tough at times. So to me, it's at the very core of what it means to be a humanist, is to be there for people in their time of trials and tribulations.
We need to fix the issues here and now, not wait until next time.
Definitely. And thinking about that, obviously, we're talking about the whole range of Norwegian society that, you can offer services to there. But one of the things that we've obviously been aware of recently is that you have a new project aimed at young people in particular to help them with their voice in society and issues around speech and free speech and things like that. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a project that is called the Ungtring 2030 project, which is, Young Voices 2030, which is a project that we do together with some other organizations, the Norwegian Institute for Human Rights. In Norwegian, I would say Fritt Ord, but free speech, and other organizations. And we do this project together with them, where we get young people together to discuss and tell us grown-ups how the status is on free speech for young adults, for the 15 to 30 years olds, and help us understand what are the issues they think about when it comes to free speech and what they think about. And they produce a report that is, of course, sent to the politicians and to the different organizations, and to give an insight into what young people think about their possibility to have free speech. And of course, in this, when all of these youth meet, they also get training in using their voices. So that we have seen a lot of media participation from these kids that have been part of this project so far. And the idea is that this project is going to run for several years and produce different reports. And they meet up in regions so that they can discuss in their areas, but also nationally. So this is a both regional and national project. we often talk about how difficult it can be for young people to say what they mean and what they feel. And we talk about how young people feel about speaking out on different topics in their classrooms or online or different places. This project tries to take this seriously by getting to know what they actually think about this. And I hope that this is something that will lead to good results for free speech, but also something that will potentially happen also other places.
You also have the Humanist Compass project, which is looking at 15 to 18-year-olds on kind of similar topics. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. The difference is that the Ungtring project is broader than just the humanists. So that is open for youth from different parts of Norwegian society, and they come from many different backgrounds. But the Humanistic Compass project is our dab into leadership training for 15 to 18-year-olds. And of course, free speech is some of the things that they discuss there and learn about. But it gives us, of course, the possibility to influence more of our members' lives longer than just the confirmation period. And also, of course, welcoming them into the organization in a nice way and giving them training, giving them information, and giving them, of course, a community. And we haven't been so good at doing this to bridge the gap between being a confirmant and being a confirmant leader or active in the organization in different manners. So it's nice to have a project that tries to take this seriously and tries to take the youth seriously and including them into the organization and enabling them to have their voice also inside and outside the organization.
That's an amazing project. You mentioned a bit earlier, Christian, about the work that you're doing on the chaplaincy work and learning from other organizations across Europe. And we've mentioned on the podcast before that one of the big ways that collaborations are happening with humanist organizations right now is through a network of members of Humanists International have set up the European Humanist Services Network, which is looking at things like chaplaincy, wedding provision, different aspects of the services to do with existential care that humanist organizations are offering across Europe and ways to learn from each other and help each other develop. And the Norwegian Humanist Association has really played a leading role in that collaboration. Maybe you want to tell us a bit about that, how that work's going?
Absolutely. What is the most important thing about the European Humanist Services Network is that many of the organizations are quite varied in size and in what they do and in what they are really good at. And even though the Norwegian Humanist Association is a quite big organization with a long track record, for example, in the confirmation training sector, we are quite a recent provider of existential care. And we are not doing as many weddings as, for example, the Scottish humanists do. So we need to learn from all the other organizations. And, well, some of them wants to learn from us and some wants to learn from the other humanist organizations in Europe. And being able to learn from each other is really important if we want to build a strong humanist movement in Europe and in the rest of the world so that we can, well, not do all the same mistakes in different places and learn to be the best humanist movement that we can be. And we have now seen an unity on what is a humanist wedding. To agree what a humanist wedding is, it can sound so simple, but at the same time, it's really important that we know what we are talking about. One has also agreed upon what is actually the name of the existential care, what language should we use to talk about this so that we know that we talk about the same things. So the EHSN network has focused on youth education, existential care, and ceremonies. And it's so interesting to hear about all the different kinds of discussions and all the learning that happens on these meetings and to learn about the different sub-projects that I set up. So for me, as a president of the Norwegian Humanist, it's so good to hear about all the ways that we can be an example for other countries, but also, more importantly for me as the president, what we can learn from other humanist movements in different parts of Europe to be a better humanist organization for our members. So that is really important. So I'm looking really forward to what we can do with this project now and in the future. So you can hear more about it in the World Congress in Ottawa in August.
Absolutely. And as we've mentioned before, we're incredibly grateful that the EHSN network is the main sponsor of this year's World Humanist Congress. So you will definitely hear a lot more about that collaboration if you're not already a part of it in Ottawa. And in actual fact, one of the things which has been very interesting for us is, we've been incredibly impressed by the way that this collaboration has developed. And I think, like you mentioned, one of the interesting aspects of it is it's sort of asymmetrical. It's networks which are growing at different rates and involving different people based on what's, we've talked about the fact that in some cultures, the humanist confirmation ceremonies just might not be something that would get traction. So there's a lot of differences, but moving forward on the issues which we agree about. Actually, one of the things that we've been working on in Humanists International, we've been talking about ways of assisting regional development for some time. And in the past month, we've just appointed David Pineda as our first ever Latin American development officer. So he'll be looking at different ways to learn from other parts of the world. So we're actually hoping that David will be able to join the EHSN meeting later on in the year in Romania to learn from some of the things that have developed there so that can be an inspiration for some form of regional growth and development in Latin America. So I think there's a lot of different lines and connections that we can hopefully draw across the world here.
Absolutely. And even though it's very different context, we can always learn from each other to be better organizations for our members and for those who want to use our services.
Thanks so much, Christian. I guess we're coming to the end of our time, but I was wondering if you had any sort of parting thoughts or words for the members we've been talking about, for humanists around the world across the various contexts that they find themselves in.
I really look forward to meeting them all in Ottawa, at least those who are able to come to Ottawa. And I would love to chat about this to a much greater extent with people that want to stop me during the conference in Ottawa. So I'm really looking forward to that. But looking outside of our countries and seeing how they do things in other places in the humanist movement is really important, I think. So I hope that we can learn from each other, and not everything that the Norwegian humanists do would look the same or be as natural a part of humanist movement in Ireland or in, Peru. So, but it might be things that they do that seems, why don't we do this already? And vice versa. So I'm really looking forward to meeting fellow international humanists again.
Thank you, Christian. Maybe one last question from me. Maybe we could give a very short advert to people for a demonstration which you will do in Ottawa of a stumbling cafe.
Absolutely. A stumbling cafe is a very informal, dialogue-based cafe where we talk about how we during our lives stumble, what things we do badly, how we react to doing things that we are not as proud of or that we want to change afterwards. And it's a nice place to drink some coffee, talk to each other about important things. And I will guide the participants through a menu with both an aperitif starter, a main course, a dessert, and a doggy bag afterwards as well, about philosophical thoughts about, what do you do when we stumble through life?
Well, that sounds fantastic. More details will be available on the Congress website. Christian, thank you so much. It's been amazing to hear about the fantastic work that you're doing in Norway. And yes, we look forward to seeing you in Ottawa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Christian. If you found this episode useful, please share it with others, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and leave us a rating and 5-star review. It makes a big difference in helping new listeners find the show. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover or someone you'd like to suggest as a guest, you can contact us via the links in the show notes. To find out more or join Humanists International, visit humanists.international and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you to our producer James and the team at Humanize Live, and to the team at Humanists International, without whom we'd have very little to talk about. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom of Thought.